I remember the first time Daniel hesitated, not because it was dramatic or loud or obvious in a way that would have made it easy for me to recognize it as a warning, but precisely because it wasn't, because it slipped so quietly into the moment that it almost felt like it belonged there, like a natural pause in an otherwise perfect rhythm, something so small I nearly mistook it for tenderness rather than distance. We were sitting in a quiet cafe tucked along a narrow street in Edinburgh, the kind of place that felt untouched by time, where the wooden tables carried faint scratches from years of strangers' conversations, and the air smelled faintly of roasted coffee beans and rain-damp coats, and outside the window, the sky hung low and gray as if it had something heavy to confess but didn't quite know how. The rain tapped softly against the glass, not urgent, not violent, just steady, like a quiet insistence that something was there, something I should have been listening to more carefully. Daniel was across from me, his fingers loosely wrapped around a ceramic cup, his expression warm, attentive, the kind of presence that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced before, and I remember thinking, with a kind of fragile certainty, that this was what it meant to find the right person. Not perfection, but ease, a sense that nothing had to be forced. It was in that moment, carried by comfort and the illusion of safety, that I asked the question, "Can I meet your parents sometime?" I didn't think about it before I said it. It wasn't calculated or loaded with expectation. It was simple, natural, the kind of question that belongs in a future you assume you're already walking toward together. I even smiled when I asked it, imagining what his answer might be, imagining faces, stories, a history I could step into and become part of. And then he hesitated. It wasn't long. Anyone else might not have noticed. But I did, because when you're falling in love, you begin to memorize the rhythm of another person, the timing of their expressions, the way their eyes move, the subtle shifts in their voice, and in that brief pause, something changed, something tightened just beneath the surface. His smile didn't disappear, but it altered in a way I couldn't fully explain at the time. It became more controlled, less instinctive, like something he was holding in place rather than something that came naturally. "They're complicated," he said, letting out a small, almost rehearsed laugh, the kind that seems designed to soften what comes before and after it. "You wouldn't enjoy it. Trust me. Trust me." Those two words should have reassured me. Instead, they settled somewhere deep inside my chest, not heavy enough to alarm me, but not light enough to ignore entirely either. Still, I nodded, because that's what you do when you care about someone. You accept the boundaries they set, even when you don't fully understand them, because you believe there must be a reason, and more importantly, you believe that reason will eventually be shared with you. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. Love, I would later realize, has a way of teaching you how to reinterpret discomfort as patience, how to translate silence into depth, how to convince yourself that what you don't know isn't a gap but a space waiting to be filled when the time is right. It makes incomplete answers feel like promises rather than omissions, and it wraps uncertainty in something that feels dangerously close to hope. So I let it go. Or at least, I told myself I did. Months passed, unfolding in a way that felt both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, as if we were building something solid out of quiet routines and shared moments that seemed too small to matter but somehow became everything. We moved into his apartment, a place that overlooked narrow stone streets that glistened after the rain, where the mornings arrived softly through pale light filtering between old buildings, and the nights stretched long and intimate, filled with conversations that made me feel like I was being led into something real. We built habits. Morning coffee in silence that didn't feel empty, late dinners that turned into laughter, the kind of closeness that makes you believe you found not just love, but a kind of home inside another person. And yet, even as everything seemed to deepen, there was a part of him that remained untouched, like a room in a house whose door stayed closed no matter how long you lived there. I noticed it in small ways at first. The absence of photographs. Not just framed ones, but any at all. No childhood memories, no family gatherings, no evidence of a life before the version of him I knew. When I asked about his past, he answered, but always in fragments, always in a way that felt carefully measured, as though he were giving me just enough to satisfy the question without ever revealing anything that might lead to another. And still, I told myself it was normal. Not everyone is close to their family. Not everyone carries their past with them. Not everyone wants to revisit what they've chosen to leave behind. Those were the explanations I gave myself, over and over. until they began to sound like truths. The proposal came on a day that felt almost unreal in its beauty. We stood on a cliffside overlooking the sea, the wind sharp and wild, the waves crashing below with a kind of relentless force that made everything else feel small by comparison. And when he knelt in front of me, his eyes steady, his voice certain, I didn't hesitate, not even for a second. I said yes as if there had never been a question. Because in that moment, whatever doubts had existed were drowned out by something louder, something brighter. The belief that love, once chosen, could smooth over anything unresolved, that whatever remained unspoken would eventually find its way into the light. But it didn't. If anything, the closer we got to the wedding, the more defined that silence became, until it was no longer something I could pretend not to see. I brought up his parents again one evening, gently, carefully, as if the way I asked might change the way he answered. Should we send them an invitation? I asked, trying to keep my tone light, casual, as though it didn't matter either way. He didn't even look up at first. They won't be at the wedding, he said. Just like that. No hesitation this time. No softness to ease the words. Just a statement, delivered with the same indifference one might use to comment on the weather, as if this was something already decided, something not open for discussion. I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't loud. It didn't break all at once. It was quieter than that. More dangerous, perhaps, like the slow formation of a crack beneath the surface, something that begins so small you can almost convince yourself it isn't there. But it was. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, to smooth it over with logic and love and trust, it remained, growing, deepening, waiting. Because for the first time, I realized that this wasn't just about his parents. It was about the part of his life he refused to let me touch. And the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became, not because of what I knew, but because of what I didn't. Because love is supposed to bring you closer to someone's truth. But standing there, engaged to the man I believed I knew better than anyone, I was beginning to understand something I wasn't ready to face. I had fallen in love with a version of Daniel that existed only in the spaces he allowed me to see. And somewhere beyond that, there was something he was still hiding. At first, I tried to respect his boundaries, not in the passive, indifferent way people sometimes pretend to understand each other, but in the deliberate, conscious way you do when you are afraid that pushing too hard might fracture something fragile, something you are not yet ready to lose. That's what love is supposed to be, isn't it? Trust that what is withheld is not meant to harm you. Patience that what is hidden will one day be revealed willingly. Understanding that not all silences are betrayals. Some are simply wounds waiting for the right moment to be touched. I repeated those beliefs to myself so often that they began to feel like rules I had no right to question. And yet, silence has a way of growing louder over time. At first, it lingers at the edges of your awareness, something you can easily dismiss, like a faint sound in another room. But the longer it stays, the more it demands to be noticed, until eventually it is no longer something you hear, it becomes something you feel, pressing inward, filling spaces you didn't realize were empty until they began to echo. I began to notice the absence of things more than the presence of them. There were no photographs of Daniel as a child. Not a single one. No awkward school pictures, no holiday snapshots, no smiling faces captured in moments that people usually hold on to as proof that they belonged somewhere once. There were no albums tucked away in drawers, no forgotten boxes filled with old memories, not even a casual mention of moments that stretched beyond the version of him I knew. It was as if his life had been carefully edited, trimmed down to begin at the exact point he wanted it to be seen. 21. University. Everything before that. Gone. And the more I noticed it, the more unnatural it began to feel, because even people who hate their past carry traces of it. Small, unavoidable fragments that slip through in conversation, in habits, in the way they react to certain words or memories. But with Daniel, there was nothing. Just a clean beginning. Too clean. One evening, the weight of that absence settled over me more heavily than usual, though I couldn't have explained why. Maybe it was the way he had been distant that day, distracted in a way that felt different from before, not guarded, but watchful, as though something unseen had followed him home and he wasn't sure if it had been noticed. He disappeared into the bathroom with a quiet excuse, the sound of running water filling the apartment soon after, steady and isolating, cutting him off from everything beyond that closed door. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to focus on nothing in particular, telling myself I was imagining things, that whatever unease had begun to take root inside me was nothing more than the natural anxiety of approaching a life-altering commitment. Then his phone lit up beside me. The screen brightened the dimness of the room just enough to draw my attention, just enough to make it impossible to ignore. I didn't mean to look. Or maybe I did. In the quiet, unspoken way curiosity begins to justify itself when it feels like the only path left toward understanding. A message. Just a name. Mom. My heart stopped in a way that felt physical, as though something inside my chest had seized, tightening so suddenly that for a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't even fully process what I was seeing beyond the sharp, undeniable clarity of that single word. Mom. Not mother. Not a name. Not something ambiguous or distant. Something intimate. Immediate. Alive. I stared at the screen, waiting for it to fade, half expecting it to disappear as quickly as it had appeared, as though it might somehow correct itself, transform into something that made more sense, something that aligned with the version of reality I had been given. But it didn't. It stayed. Solid. Unmoving. Real. I didn't open it. I couldn't. Because in that moment, opening it felt like crossing a line I wouldn't be able to uncross, like stepping into something that would change not just what I knew, but how I understood everything that had come before it. And a part of me, still clinging desperately to the belief that there was a reasonable explanation, wasn't ready for that. Not yet. But something shifted inside me. Something dark. Something restless. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something quieter, more insidious. The slow, creeping realization that there was a truth just beneath the surface of everything I had accepted, something waiting to be uncovered whether I was ready for it or not. Because if his parents truly didn't exist in his life, why was she still reaching out? The question lingered long after the screen dimmed, long after the sound of the shower stopped, long after he stepped back into the room as though nothing had happened, as though the world had remained exactly as it was before that message appeared. I watched him carefully that night. Not obviously, not in a way that would have revealed the shift inside me, but quietly, attentively, noticing things I might have overlooked before, the way he checked his phone just a little too quickly, the way his expression flickered for the briefest second before smoothing itself back into something neutral, controlled. He didn't mention the message. Not once. And I didn't ask. Because now, the silence between us wasn't just something I was respecting. It was something I was listening to. That night, I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling as shadows from passing headlights moved slowly across it, stretching and dissolving in a pattern that felt almost hypnotic, if not for the tension coiled tightly in my chest, refusing to let me rest. His breathing was steady, calm, unaffected, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. I turned my head slightly, just enough to look at him without fully facing him, studying the familiar lines of his face in the dim light, searching for something I hadn't seen before, something that might explain the growing distance I could now feel even in the space between us. And for the first time, I noticed how easy it was for him to look peaceful, how effortless it seemed for him to exist without the weight of the questions that were now keeping me awake. Or maybe he wasn't peaceful at all. Maybe he was simply better at hiding it. The thought settled into my mind with a quiet certainty that frightened me more than anything else had so far, because it suggested something deeper than a simple omission, something more deliberate than discomfort or avoidance. It suggested control. Careful, practiced control. And once that possibility took shape, it refused to leave. Because if he could hide something as fundamental as his connection to his own family, if he could look me in the eye and speak about them as though they were no longer part of his world while still receiving messages from them in the quiet moments I wasn't meant to see, then what else had he chosen not to tell me? What else had I accepted without question, simply because I trusted him enough not to look closer? The questions came slowly at first, then all at once, layering over each other until they became impossible to separate, impossible to silence. What kind of past requires this level of erasure? What kind of man builds a future while burying where he came from? And most terrifying of all, what kind of man asks you to marry him, while making sure there are parts of his life you will never be allowed to see? I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. Because somewhere in the quiet, in the space between his steady breathing and my racing thoughts, I realized something I hadn't been willing to admit before. This wasn't just silence anymore. It was something else. Something intentional. And whatever it was beginning to sound a lot like a warning. I didn't plan to become someone who snoops, not in the beginning, not when love still felt like something clean and uncomplicated, something that didn't require questions that lingered too long or answers that didn't quite fit. I had always believed, perhaps naively, that trust was not something you negotiated with yourself, not something you chipped away at piece by piece until there was nothing left but suspicion dressed up as intuition. But doubt is a powerful force. It doesn't arrive all at once, demanding to be acknowledged. It seeps in slowly, almost gently, disguising itself as concern, as curiosity, as a need for reassurance that feels reasonable enough to justify. It erodes your certainty in quiet, persistent ways until the line between right and wrong begins to blur, until the things you once swore you would never do begin to feel not only acceptable, but necessary. It started small. So small, in fact, that I convinced myself it didn't count. A glance at his unlocked laptop one afternoon while he was out picking up groceries, the screen still glowing faintly on the table as if it had been waiting for me, as if it had been left there intentionally, though I knew that wasn't true. My reflection hovered faintly over the darkened edges of the display, my hesitation staring back at me, asking a question I wasn't ready to answer. Don't do this. But I did. At first, I told myself I wasn't looking for anything specific. I wasn't digging, not really. I was just noticing, letting my eyes move across what was already there, what had been left in plain sight. A search history that revealed nothing unusual. News articles, work-related pages, the occasional restaurant or travel destination we had already talked about. Normal things. Safe things. But normality, I had begun to realize, can be curated. And the more I looked, the more I felt that strange, unsettling awareness that I wasn't seeing everything, just the parts he had allowed to remain visible. I closed the laptop that day, my heart beating faster than it should have, my hands colder than I expected, and I told myself that was enough. That whatever unease had driven me to that moment had been misplaced, exaggerated, something I could still choose to ignore. But doubt, once given space, doesn't retreat. It waits. It grows. And it returns stronger than before. The next time was easier. That frightened me more than anything else. There was less hesitation, less internal resistance, as though a boundary had already been crossed and could no longer be restored to its original state. I moved through his things with a quiet efficiency that felt unfamiliar, almost detached, as if I were watching myself from a distance, aware of what I was doing but unable, or unwilling, to stop. Old emails this time. Nothing recent. Nothing obvious. Just fragments. Conversations that ended abruptly. Names I didn't recognize. References to places and events that had never been mentioned to me. Small, disjointed pieces of a life that felt parallel to the one I knew, existing alongside it but never intersecting in a way that would reveal the full picture. And then I found it. It wasn't hidden, not in any deliberate way that would have required effort to uncover. If anything, its ordinariness made it more unsettling, because it suggested that whatever it represented wasn't something he believed I would ever see, or perhaps something he no longer thought about enough to conceal. An address. Saved without context, without explanation, sitting quietly among other unrelated information as though it belonged there, as though it meant nothing at all. But it didn't feel like nothing. Not to me. Not anymore. I stared at it for a long time, longer than I meant to, my eyes tracing each line as if repetition might reveal something new, something hidden between the letters and numbers that would tell me why it mattered, why it felt like the answer to a question I hadn't fully formed until that moment. It wasn't far. Just outside the city. A coastal town I vaguely recognized but had never visited, the kind of place people go when they want distance, when they want quiet, when they want to disappear without truly vanishing. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for my phone, not to call him, not to ask, but to look it up, to confirm that it was real, that it existed in the world beyond the screen in front of me. It did. Of course it did. And the moment that confirmation settled in, something inside me shifted from uncertainty to something far more dangerous. Certainty. Not about what the address meant, not about what I would find there, but about the fact that it was connected to the part of his life he had refused to share. The part he had erased. My pulse pounded so loudly I could hear it, feel it in the back of my throat, in my fingertips, in the tightness of my chest as I tried to steady my breathing, tried to anchor myself in something rational, something that would stop the spiral of thoughts threatening to pull me under. I told myself I just wanted answers. Closure. Reassurance. Something that would make all of this feel like an overreaction, like a misunderstanding that could be resolved with a simple explanation, a conversation that would end with relief instead of regret. But deep down, beneath all the justifications and careful reasoning, I knew the truth. This wasn't about curiosity anymore. This was about fear. Fear of what I didn't know. Fear of what I might discover. Fear that whatever existed at the end of that address would confirm something I wasn't ready to face, that the man I was about to marry was not the man I thought I knew. And once that fear took hold, it became impossible to ignore. It followed me through the rest of the day, through dinner, through conversation that felt increasingly hollow as I watched him speak, laugh, move through the space around me as though nothing had changed, as though I hadn't just uncovered a piece of his life that he had never once mentioned. I studied him differently now. Every word, every expression, every pause carried a weight it hadn't before, as if meaning had been layered beneath the surface and I had only just begun to see it. And the more I looked, the more distant he seemed, not physically, not in any way that could be easily defined, but in a way that felt deeper, more fundamental, as though there was a version of him just beyond my reach, existing in a place I had never been invited to enter. That night, I barely slept. And by morning, the decision had already been made. It didn't feel impulsive. It didn't feel reckless. If anything, it felt inevitable. Like something that had been building quietly within me, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be contained. Daniel left early for work, pressing a brief kiss to my forehead as he always did. His touch familiar, reassuring in a way that now felt almost cruel in its simplicity. "Don't wait up tonight," he said. "It's going to be a long day." I nodded, forcing a smile, wondering how easily he could say those words while keeping so much hidden behind them. I waited until he was gone. Not long. Just enough time for the sound of his footsteps to fade, for the silence of the apartment to settle fully around me, thick and expectant. Then I moved. Quickly. Deliberately. Before I could think too much. Before I could give myself the chance to reconsider. I grabbed my keys, my phone, my coat, each action feeling both surreal and intensely real at the same time, as though I were stepping into a version of my life I hadn't planned but could no longer avoid. At the door, I hesitated. Just for a second. My hand resting against the handle, my breath caught somewhere between what I knew and what I was about to discover. This is a mistake. The thought came uninvited, sharp and insistent. But it was too late. Because staying meant continuing to live in uncertainty, in silence, in a version of the truth that felt increasingly fragile with every passing moment. And I wasn't sure I could do that anymore. So I opened the door, stepped outside, and didn't look back. The drive felt longer than it should have, every mile stretching out as if time itself had slowed, as if the world were giving me one last chance to turn around, to abandon the path I had chosen before it led somewhere irreversible. But I didn't turn back. I followed the road as it wound away from the city, toward the coast, toward something unknown, toward the truth. Alone. Without telling him. And with every passing moment, one thought echoed louder than all the others, steady and unavoidable. Whatever I was about to find, there would be no way to unknow it. The house was older than I expected, older in a way that felt less like age and more like abandonment, as though time had not simply passed through it but had settled into its walls, seeping into the wood, the stone, the air itself, leaving behind a quiet heaviness that pressed down on everything around it.
Weathered. Silent. Almost forgotten.
It stood alone at the edge of a narrow road that curved toward the sea, its paint faded to a dull, uneven shade that might once have been white, its windows dim and watchful, reflecting nothing but the gray sky above. The garden, if it could still be called that, had grown wild in uneven patches, grass bending under the wind, creeping vines climbing along the edges of the structure as if trying to reclaim it. For a moment, I wondered if I had the wrong place. If perhaps I had misread the address, misunderstood what I had seen, allowed my imagination to build something out of nothing.
But the numbers were there. Clear. Unmistakable.
And something in my chest tightened, not with doubt, but with recognition, not of the place itself, but of the feeling it gave me.
This was not a place you arrived at by accident. This was a place people avoided.
I stood in front of it for a long time, longer than I realized, my feet rooted to the ground as my mind raced ahead, constructing possibilities, explanations, outcomes, each one more unsettling than the last. The wind moved around me in quiet, restless currents, carrying the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore, steady and indifferent, as though whatever decision I made here would change nothing beyond the small, fragile world I had built for myself.
Every instinct told me to turn back,
to get into my car, to drive away, to return to the version of my life that still existed. Uncertain, yes, but intact, still capable of being preserved if I chose not to look too closely.
This wasn't just about a lie anymore. This was about something much bigger. Something darker. Something Daniel had not just hidden, but buried.
I don't remember sitting down, not the moment my body gave in or the exact second my legs stopped holding me upright. But suddenly I was inside the house. The door closed behind me with a quiet finality that echoed louder than it should have, and I was seated at a small wooden table with a cup of tea cradled between my hands, the porcelain warm against my skin in a way that felt distant, almost unreal,
as if the sensation belonged to someone else.
The room itself felt dim, not because there was no light, but because what little light existed seemed to struggle to settle, filtering weakly through thin curtains that moved slightly with the wind outside, casting shifting shadows that made everything feel unstable, uncertain. The air carried a faint scent of something old. Dust, perhaps, or memories that had lingered too long without being disturbed. Daniel's mother, Margaret, sat across from me, her posture rigid but not unkind, her eyes fixed on me with a careful intensity that made it clear she was watching not just what I said, but how I held myself, how I breathed, how close I was to unraveling.
Like I might break at any second. And the truth was, I might have.
He left years ago, she said quietly, her voice steady but weighed down by something that felt heavier than grief, something more complicated, more unresolved.
But not the way he told you.
Every word felt like a blade, not sharp enough to cut all at once, but precise enough to sink in slowly, to make itself known with a kind of deliberate cruelty that left no room for misunderstanding. I swallowed, my throat dry despite the untouched tea in my hands, my mind scrambling to hold on to something stable, something that wouldn't collapse under the weight of what I was beginning to hear.
What do you mean?
I managed, though the question felt inadequate, too small for the enormity of what was unfolding.
Margaret didn't answer immediately.
Instead, she looked down for a moment, her gaze settling on the surface of the table as if the wood itself held something she needed to gather before continuing. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted, still quiet, but threaded now with something deeper, something closer to resignation.
There were arguments, she said. More than arguments, really. It wasn't sudden, not at first. It built over time.
Distance, resentment. Things that neither side knew how to fix without making them worse. I listened, trying to follow, trying to piece together a version of Daniel that existed before me, one shaped by conflict rather than the calm, controlled man I thought I knew. He became withdrawn, she continued, her eyes lifting briefly to meet mine before drifting away again.
Not just from us, but from everything. Like he was slowly pulling himself out of his own life.
There was something in the way she said it that unsettled me, not just the description, but the implication behind it, the sense that whatever had caused that shift was still present, still unresolved. But that wasn't the worst part,
she added after a moment, her voice tightening almost imperceptibly. A silence followed, heavier than before, and something inside me braced. Because I knew, before she even said it, that whatever came next would change everything. The worst part, she repeated, her hands folding together in front of her, fingers pressing tightly as if holding herself steady. There was a girl. My breath caught. The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended between us, simple and devastating all at once, carrying a weight that I felt instantly, instinctively, even before I fully understood why. Before you, she added. My heart began to pound again, louder than ever, each beat sharp and insistent, echoing through my chest, my throat, my ears, drowning out everything else for a moment as I struggled to keep up with the reality that was shifting beneath me. A girl. Of course there had been someone before me. That wasn't the problem. It was the way she said it. The way the words carried something unfinished, something unresolved, something that hadn't simply ended but had been interrupted. What about her? I asked, though part of me didn't want the answer, didn't want to give shape to the fear that had already begun to take form in my mind. Margaret hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. She disappeared, she said finally, her voice quieter now, as if speaking the words too loudly might make them more real. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the edges of my vision tightening as though the space around me was shrinking, closing in. Disappeared. I repeated, the word foreign on my tongue, too vague, too incomplete, demanding clarification that I wasn't sure I was ready to receive. Margaret nodded slowly, her expression tightening with something that looked dangerously close to guilt. No one knows exactly what happened, she said. One day she was there, and then she wasn't. A coldness spread through me, slow and deliberate, settling deep in my chest, in my stomach, in the spaces between my thoughts where fear begins to take root. And after that, she continued, her voice faltering slightly for the first time, Daniel changed. Completely. I closed my eyes for a moment, just a second, trying to steady myself, trying to hold on to something that still made sense, something that hadn't been altered by what I was hearing. But there was nothing. Only this. He cut us off, she said. Not all at once, but gradually. Calls became less frequent. Visits stopped entirely. And when we tried to ask him about her, about what had happened, he shut us out. Shut you out? I whispered. Margaret's lips pressed together, a faint, bitter expression crossing her face. He said we were part of the problem. The words settled heavily between us. I felt them before I understood them, the implication behind them, the accusation embedded within them. Problem. I repeated, my voice barely more than a breath. Margaret looked at me then, really looked at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name, not just sadness, not just fear, but something more complicated, something that felt like a warning she didn't know how to give. Because we knew things about her, she said slowly. Things he didn't want anyone else to know. A cold realization began to creep in. Not all at once. Not sharply. But slowly, steadily. Like something rising from beneath the surface. Something that had been there all along but had only just begun to reveal itself. Things he didn't want anyone else to know. The words echoed in my mind, overlapping with everything else. His silence, his distance, the way he had erased parts of his past, the way he had spoken about his family as if they no longer existed. This wasn't just avoidance. It wasn't just pain. It was control. Careful. Deliberate. Absolute. What kind of things? I asked, though my voice trembled, betraying the fear I could no longer contain. Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting past me, unfocused, as though she were seeing something far away, something she had tried not to remember. She wasn't what she seemed, she said finally, the words vague but heavy with implication. There were things about her life, about her past, things Daniel knew, things he chose to ignore. And when she disappeared, those things didn't disappear with her. A chill ran through me, sharp and undeniable. And you think, I started, but the words caught in my throat, the question too dangerous to fully form. Margaret's eyes returned to mine. "I think," she said carefully, "that whatever happened to her, Daniel knows more than he ever admitted." Silence followed. Heavy. Suffocating. And in that silence, the realization fully took shape. Clear. Inevitable. Terrifying. I wasn't the first woman he had hidden. I wasn't the first to be kept at a distance from the truth, from the parts of his life he refused to share. I was just the next. And as that truth settled into me, deeper with every passing second, one thought rose above all the others, louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. If she had disappeared, what did that mean for me? I drove back in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't simply fill the absence of sound but replaces it entirely, pressing in from every direction until even the smallest noise, the hum of the engine, the faint friction of tires against the road, feels distant, muted, as though I were moving through something thicker than air, something that dulled the edges of reality. Everything felt unreal. The road stretched ahead of me in long, endless lines that seemed to blur at the edges. The sky hung low and colorless above, and my hands, my own hands, gripping the steering wheel looked unfamiliar, as though they belonged to someone else, someone watching this unfold from a distance I couldn't quite reach. My mind replayed Margaret's words over and over again, each time pulling them apart, rearranging them, searching for something, anything, that might make them less devastating, less final. There was a girl. She disappeared. Daniel knows more than he ever admitted. Each repetition twisted deeper into something darker, something that refused to stay contained within the boundaries of explanation, stretching instead into possibilities I didn't want to consider but could no longer avoid. I tried to focus on the road, on the simple act of driving, on the idea that if I could just reach the apartment, just step back into the space we had built together, something might still feel normal, something might still hold. But the closer I got, the more that illusion began to dissolve. Because there is a moment, subtle but irreversible, when you realize that normality is not something you return to. It is something that, once broken, cannot be reconstructed in the same way again. By the time I parked the car, my chest felt tight, my breath shallow, as though I had been holding it for miles without realizing it. I sat there for a moment, staring at the building, at the windows I had once associated with warmth, with safety, with something close to belonging. Now they looked different. Not threatening. Not obviously changed. But altered in a way I couldn't quite define, as though I had finally learned how to see what had always been there. I stepped out, closed the door, and walked inside. Each step felt deliberate, heavier than it should have, as if I were moving towards something inevitable rather than something chosen. When I reached the apartment door, my hand hovered over the handle for a second longer than necessary, a quiet hesitation that carried more weight than any of the questions racing through my mind. Then I opened it, and everything stopped, because Daniel was already home, waiting. He stood in the middle of the living room, not moving, not distracted, not unaware, but still, focused, his presence filling the space in a way that immediately told me something was different. He wasn't surprised to see me. He had been expecting me. For a brief, suspended moment, we just looked at each other. And in that moment, I saw it. Not clearly, not in a way I could easily define, but unmistakably. Fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from confusion or concern, but the kind that comes from being found out. "Where were you?" he asked. His voice was steady, controlled, almost too controlled, as though each word had been carefully placed before it left his mouth, as though he had already rehearsed this moment, already anticipated the shape of it. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because suddenly, the question felt irrelevant, unimportant, a distraction from something much larger, something that had been building for far too long and had finally reached the point where it could no longer be avoided. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. Who was she? The words left my mouth more quietly than I expected, but they carried everything. The fear, the confusion, the accusation, the truth I was no longer willing to pretend didn't exist. The silence that followed was unbearable. It stretched between us, thick and suffocating, pressing in from every direction until it felt like the room itself had stopped breathing. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He didn't look away either.
He just stood there, his gaze locked onto mine, his expression unreadable in a way that felt more unsettling than any visible reaction could have been. For a second, just a second, I thought I saw something crack.
A flicker. A shift. Something that might have been guilt. Might have been fear. Might have been the beginning of an explanation. But then it was gone. And what replaced it was worse. Not guilt. Not shame. Something colder. Something hollow.
You shouldn't have gone there, he said.
Not what are you talking about? Not who told you. Not even I can explain. Just that. A statement.
A quiet, controlled acknowledgement that confirmed everything without offering anything in return. And in that moment, I understood something that shattered whatever was left of me.
I was never meant to know the truth. Not because it was complicated. Not because it would hurt me.
But because it was never supposed to exist in my version of his life at all.
I was meant to live in the version he created.
The version where his past began at 21.
The version where his family didn't matter.
The version where questions like mine never needed to be asked.
I was meant to replace the truth.
I went to see your mother, I said, my voice steadier now, though I could feel something inside me unraveling with every word.
She told me about the girl. His expression didn't change. Not in any way that softened the moment.
If anything, it became more distant, more closed off, as though he were retreating further into himself rather than stepping forward into the space between us.
You had no right, he said quietly. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because of their meaning, but because of what they lacked. There was no denial. No attempt to correct me. No urgency to explain what had happened. Only control. Only distance. No right.
I repeated, disbelief creeping into my voice despite everything.
I'm supposed to marry you, Daniel. I think I have a right to know who you are. You know who I am, he said. And for a moment, I almost believed him.
Because the man standing in front of me, the one who spoke calmly, who held himself with quiet confidence, who revealed only what he chose and nothing more, that man was real.
But he wasn't complete. He was a version. A carefully constructed one.
No, I said slowly, shaking my head, the truth settling into me with a clarity that felt almost unbearable.
I know who you want me to think you are. Something flickered in his eyes then. Not anger. Not quite. Something sharper. More dangerous.
You're overreacting, he said, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more deliberate, more persuasive.
You don't understand what happened.
Then help me understand, I shot back, the words breaking free before I could soften them.
Tell me what happened to her. The silence returned. But this time, it felt different. Not empty. Not uncertain. But deliberate. Chosen.
And in that silence, I realized something that terrified me more than anything else had so far.
He wasn't struggling to explain. He was choosing not to. And that choice said more than any answer ever could.
I'm trying to protect you, he said finally.
The words were soft. Measured. Almost gentle.
But they landed with a weight that made my stomach twist.
Protect me, I whispered. From what? From the truth? From him? Or from becoming something I didn't yet understand?
I stared at him, searching for something. Anything that might still feel familiar, something that might remind me of the man I had fallen in love with.
But the longer I looked, the more distant he seemed. Not physically, but fundamentally.
As though the person I thought I knew had never truly existed in the way I believed. And as I stood there, in the space we had shared, in the life we had begun to build together, I realized the most terrifying part of all. I didn't know if I was in love with him, or if I had been carefully, deliberately chosen. Chosen not because of who I was, but because of what I didn't know. And for the first time, a new question began to take shape in my mind, quieter than the others but far more dangerous.
If I had uncovered the truth, what would he do to keep it from coming any further?